Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. So in the last video we looked at this and how the context of this actually, or the way the context of which methods are executed changes to this value so that it can point to different objects like the global object or the object in which the method was executed. And in this video what we want to look at is the arrow syntax. So the arrow, or it's called an arrow function actually, is a new standard of ECMAScript 6.0, guys. So that it's also called ECMAScript 2015. That's actually its official title because the JavaScript 6.0, like the latest standard of JavaScript that was finally approved and agreed upon by all the people involved, was just done last year. So it's called ECMAScript 2015 as the official title. And you guys can check out the specification if you ever want a very dry read. Although if you really wanted to be a master at JavaScript, then that would be the best place to go probably. So that said, though, this arrow function, why did they create it? Well, they created it, number one, because they wanted to handle the way the bind was being executed. So it's lexically bound to its function so that this keyword is not being passed around and changed and stuff like that. So it's more predictable. And also it's just a shorter syntax. So in the old days, what did we do? We created functions that return something, and we would do something like var x equals function return this. So this is kind of what I touched upon in the last video. But what is x? X is an anonymous function. So guys, what is an anonymous function? You're probably asking that. That is a confusing term. But anonymous function means a function that has no name. So if you look at x, x isn't what we're talking about here. X obviously is the variable named x, but the anonymous function is the function that is assigned to the variable x. So why is it anonymous? Because it doesn't have a name. It just says function, open and close parenthesis, return this. So I could execute x and it returns the window object like we saw in the last video. But why is it anonymous? Because it has no name. It's just a function. How do we give it a name? Okay, function, I have a name. And obviously you want to do camel case. So I would do that in JavaScript. And then I could say return this. Same thing, execute, it's the same exact thing, but what's the difference? If I type x and this actually returns x, you can see function is not anonymous anymore. It says I have a name, so it's not an anonymous function. Why do I mention anonymous functions? Because number one, you need to know what they are. Number two, you need to know that the arrow functions, the newest standard of JavaScript 6.0, does not support anything but anonymous functions. So it's only for anonymous functions. So the way that I showed you guys how to actually create an anonymous function doing this the old way, we have certain things like function spelled out. We have the fact that it takes no parameters. It's just an open and close parenthesis, and then it returns an object. So it has to do, basically that is the verbose way of going about it, and that's the normal way that we've been going about it up until now. So let's look at an alternate way of being able to do that with arrow functions. So I could say var x equals, and I'm going to do open and close parenthesis, arrow, and then just say this. That's it. So when we say x, what do we have? Oh, we have an anonymous function, and if we execute x, you can see it returns the window object. So that's some crazy crap right there, isn't it? So one of the things you will need to note also is that Google Chrome is the first browser to actually support all of the ECMAScript 6.0 standards. I'm not even sure that they support all of them like 100%, but I know that they at least touched upon all the stuff that was agreed upon in the latest standard. It's going to take years probably for like IE 11 to catch up, and they may never catch up. Why? Because Microsoft browsers suck and you probably shouldn't be using them. But besides that, Chrome and Mozilla paved the way for the newest standards and everything, and it just takes forever for these things to get on board. So what has been created instead? Well, we look at things like Babel, or we look at things like TypeScript, but it provides these newest features to the browser, and you're able to write it, and then you compile the code, and then it actually breaks down to code that works on all browsers. So why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning it because this works in Chrome, but it may not work in other browsers because they haven't implemented the arrow functions yet. So the thing to keep in mind is that x is an anonymous function because anytime you're using the arrow function, it's always anonymous. It can't be anything but that. Another thing too is that this particular anonymous function has no parameters. So what if I wanted to say, you know what, this says alert X, and then we could actually say X. Then if I do this and I say X, hello world, you can see that it executed, so it said hello world. Now, with an arrow function, I actually don't have to put this in parentheses when you have one argument. The exact same thing can be done this way. Although we didn't pass in a value, so it would help if we did that. So now it says hello world. So the exact same thing. Why? Because I only have one parameter. If I had more than one parameter in my arrow function, I have to wrap it. I can't do this. At least I hope not. That would suck if I was able to do this. Yep. See, I can't do that. What I have to do in that case is I have to wrap them in parentheses. And now, if I do this, we can pass in, so we'll call X and we'll say Chris Hawks. So we're passing in two parameters. And you can see that it just concatenates both of them into Chris Hawks using the arrow function syntax. Another thing too is that this variable is set for us. So if we went ahead and we say, you know what, my anonymous function or my arrow function is going to be open and close parenthesis, arrow, it's just going to return this. So I don't have to say return, it's just going to say this. So if I said X, it returns the window object, so that's cool. Now we saw before, what happens if we assign the object X to a new object? So let's go ahead and create a new object. We'll say Y equals new JavaScript object, which is just open and close curly brace. So we look at Y, it's an object. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to say Y.X equals X. So we're attaching our X anonymous function to it. All right, so now when we look at this and we look at the Y object, we can see it's an object. We look into it, we can see, okay, there's an X now, and X is a function. And the function is just going to return this. It's an arrow function though, but anyway, so let's go ahead and if you looked at the last video in this series where I explained this variable, we know that this keyword is actually going to change because the context of which the method is executed is on this Y object. So it's going to, this would return the Y object instead of the global object. So what happens with an arrow function though? So let's go ahead and find out. It returns the window object. So that is the difference, guys. If we hadn't used the arrow function, that this wouldn't be bound to the function itself, to the X object. Instead, it would have been bound to the Y. But because hopefully I said that right. I feel like I didn't say that right. Anyway, when we created X as an anonymous function using the arrow function, it set this for us, and it set it to the window object because we created it in the global scope. We then took that value, that object, and we attached it to the Y object. And had we not used an arrow function, then the Y object, when it executes X, it would have returned the Y object as this keyword. So the fact that we use an arrow function and it sets to this for us lexically, then no matter what, I can attach X anywhere I want, and it doesn't matter the execution or where it was executed or by who it was executed or where the prototype points to or any of that stuff. It's going to send back to this the proper this context. So it's something where your this isn't going to be bouncing around to different values and stuff like that, or different objects. So hopefully you guys can wrap your head around that. That is definitely a more advanced feature, I think. This is a more advanced thing that, once again, unless you actually understand it, it bites. It'll bite you. It really will. Eventually, you're gonna be like, why is it doing that? And people are gonna blame JavaScript and say that JavaScript's a terrible language and all this stuff. And but ultimately, it's just that they need to understand that this can change to different objects depending on the context. And using anonymous functions, they might expect it to change, but it doesn't change because they used an anonymous, this anonymous arrow function to instantiate it. So a lot of different things can end up biting you. All right, so the next cool thing to discuss with an arrow function is that you're going to see some crazy stuff when you start getting into like React Redux, and especially when they start writing everything in ECMAScript 6.0. And you're going to be like, what the hell is that doing? And it's some weird stuff like this. So like var x equals, and then it's going to be open and close parenthesis. And then it can also be the same thing where it's like, okay, open close, like so, something like that. And this could be like, we'll just say this, right? So now if I was like x, what do we have here? We have these two functions wrapped inside. So you could actually have the function, like anonymous arrow functions that actually return functions themselves. So it's pretty interesting. Let's look at this in a more, I think, a better concrete way. So we're going to say, you know what, we're going to say A, and then we're going to pass A to this, and this is just going to say alerts, we'll say alert A. So now if I go ahead and I do this, we'll say testing, then, oh, I need to execute it actually, sorry. Then you can see that it actually did not pass down right. I didn't mean to do that actually. So let me fix this real quick. My bad. I don't want to pass in A to the second. I'm going to through the means of a closure, and I should probably have an entire video on closures in JavaScript. But closures are the ability for an inner function defined with another function to be able to grab parameters passed into the outer function. So normally everything's lexically scoped so that like you only have access to variables within like the curly braces of a function. Okay, so with a JavaScript closure though, you could have a function inside of a function, and that internal function can actually access parameters passed into the outer function, and also private variables set within the outer scope as well. So a lot of people hate JavaScript for that too, but through the power of closure and stuff like that, you can actually do some interesting things, and that's actually what we're doing here. You can see that var x is going to be a function that takes a parameter, which is A, and then it returns a function that uses the parameter that's passed into its outer function. So by means of a closure with arrow functions, that's what we got going on here. So if I said x now and I call it, and I'm going to pass in a value, so we'll say testing, and then I also want to say open and close because I'm actually executing the internal function of our arrow function. So open and close parenthesis, because if I don't, let me do this first. You can see that, okay, it returns this anonymous function that doesn't take any parameter, but it says alert A. So how does it know what A is? It knows what A is through the means of a closure. So if I say open and close parenthesis, then you can see testing. And that's some weirdness too for a lot of people. They're like, how does that happen? But you're going to see a lot of that kind of stuff in some of the latest versions of JavaScript. So it's quite a few things to swallow here: anonymous functions, arrow functions, and closure. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you like this content. If not, don't subscribe. All right, thanks, guys. Bye.